Hello, I'm your host Rocco Gianetta, and welcome to another edition of Speak Up Portland. Time as a concept is vast and with broad interpretations. Our lives are encompassed in the realm of time. Time can be dissected into eras, generational gaps, or a singular event. The 1960s was a tumultuous time of expectant social change. Voices in humanity swirled in the streets and especially on campus. The cauldron of social unrest was stoked by the pyres of change. The voice of the young attempted to quell the inequalities of society and pressed for the opportunity to assert its existence, to expound on the notion that violent conflict of any kind is not the answer. There was one thought, that the stealing of the Constitution that reads, "For the people and of the people," could be reversed. So what did it all mean on that spring day in May in Kent Township, Ohio, when 40,000 stories were voiced? Today, we present one of those stories, Tim Helzer.
Kent State University, located in the bucolic rolling hills of Northeast Ohio, was founded in 1910 as a two-year teacher's college. I came to Kent State in 1968 to work with Marvin Kaplan and Virginia Harvey, two highly respected people in the fields of clinical psychology and adult education, to design and implement a then not heard of before concept, the Human Resource Center, and to ultimately earn my doctoral degree. I helped create a new PhD program in small group studies and organization behavior and became its first full-time doctoral student while managing the implementation of the center's purpose to promote the preventive aspects of community mental health on campus. To serve its 20,000 students, 10,000 of whom lived on campus, Kent State had a wide array of student services. But for an institution of its size and complexity, it was unusual for the institution not to have a student counseling center, although it provided emergency psychotherapy on campus by third-year doctoral students enrolled in the university's clinical psychology department practicum. The university's Accreditation Association expected Kent State to provide these counseling services, but the university administration wanted to avoid the expense of setting up a traditional counseling center. Instead, it planned to offer this service, but not designed to counsel students on an individual or group basis. Instead, it would create one to promote the preventive aspects of community mental health. What that meant was to identify university practices and conditions around the campus that created significantly unhealthy stress in students' lives and work with faculty and staff to reduce or eliminate those things with the expected results that students would remain healthy and perform better longer under less stressful conditions.
It was an innovative concept by the administration, but lacked the administration's championing leadership that the untried startup required. And to complicate matters, university leadership valued maintaining tradition more than planned innovation. And as we'll see later, Human Resource Center requests for permission to intervene early in potentially explosive key situations were ignored or brushed aside.
The center would open in the peaceful rolling hills of Northeast Ohio against the backdrop of a decade of international and domestic social unrest. This included assassinations of national and world leaders, expanding nuclear armaments, targeted police brutality, serious civil rights violations, environmental awareness issues, and major abuses of government power. Also at this time, there existed free speech issues, several civil wars, renewed and extensive military conscription, the women's movement, and growing political division and dissent. The concept of the Human Resource Center was to create a living learning environment on campus and around nearby university community that would help students stay socially and emotionally healthy. This seemed to be better than watching them become less and less effective in coping with their personal and academic challenges, and then provide individual or group counseling to help them recover and learn new coping skills. I was hired as the center's associate director and group process specialist in human relations training and educational psychology. The three of us, Dr. Kaplan, Dr. Harvey, and I, worked together to design and develop the new program in the fall of 1968. It was to be implemented 9 months later, in the summer of 1969, during the new student orientation program, and grow into its full effectiveness over the next 2 years. However, the deadly campus events at Kent State on May 4th, 1970, and at Jackson State University 10 days later, serve today as exclamation points for the decade of the 60s that brought attention to the way local, state, and national government power addressed social change.
National social change began in 1960 when 4 black college students, Franklin McCain, David Richmond, Ezell Blair, and Joseph McNeil, all freshmen at North Carolina Agricultural and Technology College, courageously staged a peaceful sit-in at Woolworth's segregated lunch counter in Greensboro. Their aim? Demonstrate against the violence of the police-enforced racial segregation of the Negro community. At the same time, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union grew rapidly following the shot-down American U-2 spy plane and the Soviet imprisonment of its pilot. The Cold War was heating up once again.
The next year, newly elected President John Kennedy approved U.S. involvement to support the clandestine invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro forces that ended in disaster at the Bay of Pigs. It would be the most recent major example of the use of violence to attempt the overthrow of a political regime that was running counter to our national values and the Monroe Doctrine. Meanwhile, Navy Commander Alan Shepard, Jr. became America's first astronaut to venture into outer space and to return safely. Also, the American presence of U.S. military personnel and equipment became evident in a country named Vietnam.
By 1962, noting the degrading changes in natural wildlife habitat, Rachel Carson's bestseller, Silent Spring, marked the start of the worldwide environmental awareness movement, while Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn became the first American to orbit planet Earth. At the same time, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled school-initiated prayer in the public school system violated First Amendment guarantees. The government's decision to limit unlegislated change has led to violent discontent among social conservatives and is seen in today's violent attacks by pro-life activists on pro-choice advocates.
In October of 1962, the narrowly averted Cuban Missile Crisis resulted in the highest escalation of hostilities between two nuclear superpowers. And pertinent to this confrontation of near cataclysmic consequences, the number of peaceful anti-war protests grew rapidly around the world and would eventually become violent.
In June of 1963, with pressure from the U.S. Attorney's Office, amidst widespread racial violence in the South, Alabama's Governor George Wallace was forced by U.S. Marshals to step aside as the University of Alabama was mandated by a federal court order to enroll Negro students. Then, in August, 200,000 people peacefully marched on Washington's National Mall to demand civil rights for all. There, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Earlier that year, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, energized the beginning of the women's movement. Burning bras didn't seem a violent act at the time, but it would lead to burning draft cards and American flags later, and eventually more violent acts of resistance against accepting the way things used to be. In late November, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald. This would become such a high-profile, violent act that it stunned not only this nation, but also became an act with international reverberations. Vice President Lyndon Johnson became the next president of the United States, bringing with him great legislative skills from his many years in the United States Senate. In 1964, I worked as a student intern congressional staff assistant on Capitol Hill for Portland, Oregon's Member of Congress Edith Green. From my view of things on the floor of the House of Representatives, I saw President Johnson apply the art of the possible as he lined up the necessary votes for passage of major social changes for this country. And I watched in the Senate as he managed the defeat of a 57-day Southern filibuster against extending constitutional civil rights guarantees to all citizens. It was broken by a coalition of liberal Northern Democrats, conservative Southern Democrats, and moderate Republicans, and a landmark civil rights bill was passed by Congress. Soon after, President Johnson's war on poverty was initiated, and the Medicare program was enacted, while his Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, planned moving U.S. troop involvement from advisory to combatant status as the Vietnam conflict escalated.
In early August of 1964, the alleged provocations by North Vietnam were actually a clever hoax by the Johnson administration to make it appear U.S. naval ships had been victims of an unprovoked attack by the communist North Vietnamese government. Enraged by these seemingly unprovoked attacks, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It authorized the Commander-in-Chief to exercise broad war powers in Vietnam to a new level of violence to stop the assumed spread of communism across Southeast Asia. In a case of history repeating itself, 38 years later, the world accepted without proof the false reports of Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld on weapons of mass destruction. That prompted Congress once again to authorize extensive war powers for the U.S. to launch the attack on Iraq. Meanwhile, the escalation of violent conflict in Vietnam would divide this country politically and lead to ongoing social conflicts for years, resulting in a long-term war of massive economic and social costs, and include atrocities on the people of Vietnam and the self-immolation of Buddhist priests as the ultimate act of personal protest.
As a college student, I remember in early December of 1964, amidst rising political activism about many social issues, Mario Savio led the free speech movement on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. It was a peaceful protest of the university's ban against on-campus political activity. But local county deputy district attorney Edwin Meese III implored Governor Edmund Brown to authorize mass arrests of protesting students. That in turn led to more protests that temporarily shut down the university. Some political dissent was later allowed by the university, and the next year, the Vietnam Committee was formed. Some 15 years later, Meese would become President Reagan's Attorney General. By 1965, President Johnson escalated the Vietnam conflict to include massive bombing of North Vietnam and Hanoi. To support a much broader American presence there, he initiated a draft call of 100,000 that put 185,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, then authorized a continuing military conscription that grew to over 400,000 over the next 2 years. Social change continued in many forms within a wide range of organizations, most notably including the confusion over the conflicting ideologies of racial protest. It resulted in the murder of the prominent black leader Malcolm X that year by 3 black Muslims who violently reacted to his disavowal of Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam. In August, 34 people were killed in the Watts district of Los Angeles during massive riots, including widespread fires and looting that some called racial insurrections over California State Police brutality targeting black residents in LA's urban ghettos. It was becoming apparent in the general population that police brutality toward blacks was much more widespread than limited areas of the broadly segregated Deep South. In 1966, the Vietnam War was extended by President Johnson to include the American bombing of border areas of Cambodia and Laos, to interdict the Viet Cong coming into South Vietnam. Ultimately, over 500,000 U.S. military personnel would be committed to the entire Vietnam conflict, resulting in 304,000 of our troops wounded and 58,200 of them dead. These actions, along with a greatly expanded draft earlier, more than anything else, began to galvanize the American public against the war in Vietnam. Yet our national government seemed impervious to influence from the growing number of peaceful anti-war protests and mass demonstrations across the country.
The following year, 1966, scores were killed in race riots in Newark and Detroit. During the same period that Thurgood Marshall became the first African American to be appointed and confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In mid-year, Israel launched a preemptory attack and defeated the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in what became known as the Six-Day War. The West Bank and East Jerusalem was annexed, and even to this day, the fallout of that event continues to resist peace in that part of the world.
By 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive that killed 2,500 American forces in only several days. In April of that year, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis by James Earl Ray, sparking many race-related riots across the country. 2 months later, presidential candidate Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles by Jordanian nationalist Sirhan Sirhan for Kennedy's support of additional armaments to Israel. Violence seemed to be everywhere as the emergence of broadcast television brought into the American living room detailed international conflict from 10,000 miles away, along with the violence of race-based and anti-war rioting in major American cities at that time. In late summer of that year, I arrived at Kent State to begin planning the innovative student service that we expected would promote the preventive aspects of community mental health on campus. At the same time, arsonists and looters around the Democratic National Convention in Chicago faced a shoot-to-kill order by Mayor Richard Daley given to the Illinois National Guard. This instigation created the law and order mentality that politicians usurped to their own ends. And in particular, it would become most useful for Ohio Governor James Rhodes. On campus, we began our design to be called the Human Resource Center as a non-traditional resource for the entire campus, to be administered under the Office of the Vice President for Student Development. When operational, it would identify campus offices to change the kinds of activities, organizational structures, policies and practices, services and functions that appeared to create and maintain unnecessarily restrictive administrative processes, as well as many choices that led to interpersonal stress or areas of emotional conflict. To facilitate this change later, we began building trust relationships with residence hall staff, on-campus, faith-based student services, registration and student loan offices, new student orientation programs, and others. These would be the people with whom we would be working closely initially to identify, reduce, and eventually eliminate unnecessarily stressful or emotionally destructive conditions on campus in order to help students maintain their health longer and function more effectively.
The following April 1969, and despite protracted and stalled Vietnam War peace talks in Paris, more and more young Americans were conscripted by the Selective Service combat forces in Vietnam rose to a high of 545,000. By that time, American deaths already numbered 45,000. By this time, President Nixon had been elected president with a campaign platform to end the war. In July, the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam began, and despite all of the social conflict around the world, technological change continued unabated as Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon. It was a monumental feat of human ingenuity. Also in 1969, the Woodstock Music Festival happened. By counterpoint, in November, details of the U.S. Army's massacre 2 years earlier of unarmed Vietnamese villagers at My Lai became public, resulting in erasing any legitimacy of moral authority America claimed in prosecuting the war in Vietnam. Later that year, anti-war demonstrations swept the nation, centering mostly on college campuses, with more than 250,000 people marched on Washington, D.C. to protest the continuation of the Vietnam conflict. Riots around the Stonewall Inn in New York City over police violence targeting gays, lesbians, and transgenders sparked the beginning of the gay rights movement.
Then in mid-autumn of 1969, across its main and several satellite campuses throughout Northeast Ohio, all of Kent State University's black students repeatedly petitioned the university to cease student recruitment practices of KSU law enforcement program students. They believed the university to be supportive of racist hiring policies of future graduates by employee recruitment organizations. When those attempts failed, all black students peacefully withdrew from the university to enroll in other colleges and universities around the region and across the country. Following this poignant demonstration, destructive protests, primarily by white protesters, resulted in numerous arrests. These arrests led the university's administration and student conduct courts to hold student trials in intentionally undisclosed locations. Protests from those court hearings eventually resulted in more arrests by Kent City and Ohio State Police. After a Human Resource Center planning meeting one night, Bob Sanko, the new student orientation director, and I witnessed the protestations of a group of students on campus who were angry about being denied access to the university administration trial of a previously charged student protester. They found the secret trial's location, discovered the doors of the building to be locked, broke out the door windows, ripped the reinforced aluminum doors off their hinges, and stormed the building. Watching this incident from a safe distance, I said to Bob, with violence like this now in early winter, by the time spring rolls around, people could be shooting at one another. Bob said to me, "It's crazy to think that could happen here." I replied, "I really hope I'm wrong." Although the original charter of the Human Resource Center called for its involvement in helping to reduce the conditions that supported these conflicts, administrative officials refused our requests to intervene in these situations. Viewed from their position of relative powerlessness, students believed more forceful protests would be required in the future to get the university to make changes in unwanted policies, practices, and conditions.
Precursory signs of regional violence began to appear early in the next spring of 1970, when a protracted labor strike by a group of Teamsters Union locals in Northeast Ohio involved union truck drivers shooting out the windshields of non-union rigs from freeway overpasses. In response, Ohio's Governor, James Rhodes, who was running for the Ohio Republican Party's U.S. Senate nomination, called out the National Guard to provide armed protection along state and national freeways and turnpike systems that served the heavily populated triangle of Cleveland, Akron, and Youngstown, in which the Kent Township was located.
At the time, much of America was expecting Vietnam to de-escalate in its war. But on April 29, 1970, President Nixon again widened U.S. involvement in Vietnam's Civil War by ordering U.S. ground troops and close air support into Cambodia to interdict the Viet Cong's transport of combat materiel and troops into South Vietnam. When Nixon bypassed the Senate's War Declaration authority with his decision to expand the war, he violated Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution as it applied to managing the Vietnam conflict. Kent State students interpreted Nixon's unilateral order that way and thought it was a blatant and reckless act. KSU graduate student Steve Sheroff was teaching American history on campus at that time. He was especially upset by President Nixon's abuse of the Constitution by extending American combat troops and close air support further into surrounding Southeast Asia. To his class, Sheroff said, "Because of Nixon's actions, the U.S. Constitution was dead and might as well be buried." On May 1st, he and several students did just that. They dug a hole and symbolically buried a copy of the Constitution. Later that evening, other students, after drinking beer in downtown Kent Township, uncharacteristically ventured forth as a raucous band of hooligans, burning debris and smashing storefront windows. Townspeople and local shopkeepers feared the amassing crowds and growing violence. Seeing this as an opportunity to show fearful voters he was the law and order senatorial candidate, Ohio's Republican Governor James Rhodes ordered the National Guard's weekend warriors away from their months of Northwest Ohio Turnpike overpass bivouac and onto the Kent State campus. Announcing his decision to bring law and order to these student demonstrators, Governor Rhodes said, "They're worse than the brown shirts and the communist element, and also the night riders and the vigilantes. They're the worst type of people that we harbor in America. I think we're up against the strongest, well-trained, militant revolutionary group that has ever assembled in America." The next day, Saturday, May 2nd, a wooden World War II-era building used for ROTC classes was set ablaze. Students wanted to see the symbol of a military presence on campus destroyed. It's unclear who actually started the fire, but substantial speculation pointed to an FBI informant who wanted to provoke and justify the government's response with military force by creating an incident that would appear to be student-initiated. The Ohio National Guard stormed the area, firing tear gas to disperse the crowd, declaring the entire campus to be under martial law, the Ohio National Guard General Sylvester Del Corso denied all access to campus from the surrounding town and set up strategic command and control positions in university administration offices throughout the campus. Two of my graduate student colleagues, Jerry Young and Bob Bain, both with military experience, and I watched the scene unfold and wondered if the guardsmen were equipped with live rounds. We all assumed that would be far too dangerous to effectively manage crowd control and quickly dismissed the idea as the fog of tear gas drifted over us. By 10 a.m. Monday morning, May 4th, word was spreading fast across campus that a rally was being organized by several student and faculty leaders. It was planned to take place at noon that day on the Commons at the Victory Bell to consider the incongruity of armed troops declaring martial law on a university campus. I suspected it was going to be a classic case of the irresistible force about to meet the immovable object. During my lunch hour that day, while waiting in an Akron, Ohio repair garage for my car to be fixed, I heard over the shop radio a news flash that state troops were killed on the KSU campus. I wondered, how could this happen, knowing that it was highly unlikely students would have been armed with anything more than insults, a few rocks and sticks, and an occasional Ohio National Guard tear gas canister fired by the troops and tossed back by the students. An hour later, my car was repaired, and I was back on the road, returning to the freeway east to Kent Township area. As I came off the exit, I approached a heavily armed blockade and checkpoint manned by combat-ready Ohio National Guard troops in armored personnel carriers. I could hardly believe my eyes as I entered what became a crime scene and as the campus was completely shut down after the shooting. Tens of thousands of students, resembling war refugees in an old newsreel, filed off campus and along the roads leading out of Kent, hauling their belongings on their backs and looking for a way home. It had become a war zone amidst the rolling hills of northeastern Ohio farm country. After May 4th, Virginia Harvey and I, the only remaining personnel managing the Human Resources Center, worked over the next 2 years, attempting through a series of multiple small discussion groups around the community to help students, faculty, and townspeople alike to make sense of it all and somehow heal from this tragedy. At the same time, I completed my doctoral research on the university's organizational leadership during this series of events and was awarded my PhD. In August of 1972, it was time for my wife and 2 sons and me to return to the West Coast, where I continued my career as an international management consultant and professor of organizational leadership.
May 4th, 1970, closed the chapter on the 1960s. It would take another 9 years for the families and victims to receive a semblance of restitution from the courts and a government that laid down roadblocks, beginning with the Nixon White House and Hoover's FBI. Society has created the concept of government. The mission of these elected management entities is to maintain the social and economic order to over 7 billion people. We hold the proxy. If all of the world's religions would adhere to their spirituality, not the politics, then perhaps the madness of today, which is the same madness as yesterday, will negate the madness that we need not repeat tomorrow. Within each life, the curtain rises and the curtain falls. It's what happens in the interim that distinguishes us in achieving a peaceful coexistence or to continue with disparaging inequities. Even with their bloodshed on that spring day, The lesson has not been learned. Will we ever learn?